Welcome, everyone, to the panel discussion on expanding supplier inclusion and verification. So great to have everyone together for our first session. So, as many of you know, over the past 25 years, social procurement has grown by challenging the status quo of traditional procurement. But it's important that we continue to question our current practices, even those within social procurement, so we can work towards true inclusion. So, how do we ensure that businesses owned by equity deserving groups are engaged in the marketplace? How does our current environment help and hinder the inclusion of diverse suppliers in our economy? To help answer some of these questions, I'm joined today by Dolores Coelho from Indigenous Services Canada and Hanifa Kassam from the City of Toronto and AnchorTO. Thank you both so much for being here today. All right, let's get started. So let's set the scene a little bit. Dolores, what does supply chain diversity mean to you and your work? Maybe introduce some of the work you're doing with the federal government.
Thank you, and welcome all. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land in which I work, play, and live in is on the traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you today. So, when I speak about what does the supply chain diversity mean to me and the work that we do, it's really about how we're engaging Indigenous peoples, communities. So, for example, just a quick overview of the federal work that we currently do. We're working on engagement and co-development of some of our policies. We're performing a lot of outreach sessions on a national basis to speak about PSIP's modernized policy and what we need to do. We work with a lot of sessions with the federal government departments on how we can reach what we call the mandatory 5% Indigenous procurement, which is a mandatory approach to engage our federal departments and agencies to procure with Indigenous businesses, etc. And we have a lot of continued work with both the federal government agencies and Indigenous communities and businesses on how we build capacity, for example, local regional approaches. So when I'm asked what does the supply chain diversity mean to me and to the work I do, it means all of this encompass it because we need to take into consideration that Indigenous businesses don't really consider themselves as a diverse group. They consider themselves as we are Indigenous businesses, communities, and peoples from Canada. We built this country. So, how can we build on to that? That's what's really important, while including all of the other diverse groups to also be part and enjoy the luxuries of life and be able to compete and add to our socioeconomic benefits.
Wow. Okay. So this is pretty central to everything that you're doing and the movement that's happening at the federal level. Hanifa, if we could maybe scale it back a little bit, do you mind talking about your work at the municipal level and some of the demographics that you're looking to include in your work?
Sure. Thank you, Charlotte, and everyone for joining today's conversation. I too would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to start by honoring the land that we are on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. It is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation. And I'm calling from Toronto. So, in terms of what does supply chain diversity mean to me and the work that I am doing with the City of Toronto and with AnchorTO, well, I think for us, it means a number of different things. Talking about it from a network of 18 public sector institutions that are focused in prioritizing social procurement, it means having a greater local impact and recognizing that our policies and approaches to procurement are and have been built to support and advance certain types of individuals, often leaving behind those from equity deserving communities. And it's about how do we systemically adjust our programs and policies by reinventing them in a way that centers equity, centers the lived experiences of those that have been uh, unincluded or not involved in the development of these initiatives and policies in the first place. And so for us, it's about, in many ways, disassembling and rebuilding our approaches to doing procurement, but also to identify how to address and create inclusive economies in a way that can alleviate poverty, that can address more systemic inequities like workforce development, access to employment, and so on. And so for us, workforce development and social procurement and supplier diversity are tools and instruments that work hand in hand to create a more equitable and inclusive economy. And we see them as that, as tools that work in collaboration with a whole host of other types of activities that our institutions can take leadership, but also ownership over in terms of deploying across the city, and including the city of Toronto.
It's interesting. So you mentioned poverty reduction as one of the outcomes that could come from diversifying our supply chain. Are there any other examples of additional value that you see coming from this work?
Absolutely. So, in your introduction, you mentioned inclusion as being central to the why, as to how important social procurement is to not only public sector institutions, but industry, large scale community investment opportunities, and the alike. And I say inclusion not only because it is an important value to have, but it's also one that is not necessarily embedded in how social procurement, or procurement perhaps more broadly, is integrated into how we currently make decisions or engage communities or see a range of participation for different equity deserving communities in terms of a pipeline for procurement. So one example I would give is in some recent work that we've been doing to study our understanding as to why certification is such a central point to in embedding social procurement in the purchasing pipelines of institutions, is that what we've learned is, while it is a tool that many institutions have adopted to advance social procurement, it's also been similarly a tool that has been one that has excluded many types of diversely owned businesses from the procurement process. And so when we think about social procurement, it's a balancing act. It is recognizing that in order to have innovation, we have to take chances, and we have to do things in a way that test our tolerance for various types of risk. But at the same time, we have to be clear that equity and inclusion take intentional action, and that in some cases, when it comes to certification, for example, some of our decisions around policy can actually have inadvertent negative effects on the same communities that we're hoping to engage in these types of pipelines themselves. And so our research has shown that, for example, the Black community doesn't has shown that participation in social procurement has been challenging because of certifying requirements, that the burden to participate and to access certification is not only cumbersome, but it's costly. There's also challenges around trust and engagement. And so we're asking the same communities that we want to feel included in our procurement process to adopt a practice that requires the trust of them to have in us in a way that we don't have with those organizations themselves. So it's an interesting dichotomy that's happening here, but I think at the same time, we are pushing the boundaries to have a more open and transparent conversation about how do we make social procurement one of the most utilized tools to advance social inclusion, while at the same time one that is accessible, transparent, and built with the end users in mind.
Wow. So, I mean, if we take a critical eye at our current social procurement practices, you've identified some barriers: verification, certification for suppliers, and it's deterring participation. Dolores, I was hoping you could provide another perspective on, if you could bring a critical eye to your work and current practices, and are there any barriers that you see existing that's preventing a more diverse supply chain?
Um, Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the barriers, when we talk about that, there's four identified gaps or barriers that we can see from Indigenous businesses and suppliers. One of them could be access to capital, or what programs could exist for Indigenous businesses to start up. That's a big barrier. Another one is the size of the types of projects that are being procured. There could be projects between 25K to 100K compared to projects of over 1 million, where Indigenous businesses don't feel they have that capacity to fulfill those types of requirements. Other barriers could be some of the mandatory requirements that are built into these types of procurement vehicles, security clearance. It could be bonding. It could be surety insurance, etc. And as we're working and being in the PSIP for the past 24 years, we've been trying to still explore how can we find a system that could happen, help Indigenous businesses, and I think other diverse groups that are probably competing for federal government projects probably fall into the same types of categories. Bonding is a big issue depending on your location, where you live, and so on and so forth. Being able to have surety insurance to fulfill a requirement if it's in construction. Construction is such a big commodity on a national basis. Also, some of the gaps or barriers would be the complexity of the federal procurement process. As an example, really understanding the tender process and how do you submit a proposal. That's something that's very scary, and it could be in different diverse groups. And how and who can assist in the developing an Indigenous business and giving them the tools to be able to be able to compete. I over the years I've mentioned to a lot of our Indigenous businesses, it's not just about like reaching out to the federal government to help you with that. Did you ever consider actually contacting another Indigenous business? It could be your competitor, but many Indigenous businesses that have developed over the years are ready to assist any Indigenous business to give them clarity and a hand. So that's kind of important. Um, and lack of capacity. In this point, it doesn't only mean the number of Indigenous businesses that exist to be able to compete. Lack of capacity could be, as an Indigenous business, I may not have the capacity to bid on a requirement financially. I may not have all of these other ins and outs like bonding, surety. I may not have the appropriate skills and development or Indigenous employees that can fulfill the contract. And it's all about them, us trying to assist them in finding the avenues or tools that could be available for them to work on that and be able to successfully compete for Indigenous projects. Some of the mandatory requirements instilled in some of the procurement processes can be very overrated or over and above, meaning the number of years that a business needs to demonstrate that they've been in business, how many qualified Indigenous employees or resources that can fulfill a requirement. So these are some of the gaps that I see that we're faced to on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so if capacity building, let's go to capacity building, is one of the barriers you've identified through your work and your experience. Do you see any solutions that exist right now that you've seen work?
Yep, some of the solutions are connecting Indigenous businesses to the proper programs that may exist, not only within ISK and CERNAC, but ESDC, other programs that are there to develop that. We do have what we call grants and contributions, and then a lot of times we have contribution agreements that we do set with Indigenous organizations so that they can do studies and analyze how they can create opportunities for Indigenous businesses as far as that's concerned. So there are different kinds of methods that we use in order to enhance and close those kind of gaps.
So, Hanifa, you identified certification as a barrier. Do you have any, is there some solutions that you can think of that you've been working towards?
So I mentioned some recent work that AnchorTO has been leading in partnership with Social Canada to explore what different validation models exist and how to go about deploying a self-attestation model where the model was reliant and embeds trust in the supplier to self-identify what intersectionality or equity deserving community that they identify with, and that through the process there would be varying levels of information collection that was used to I would say not validate, but also create a process that was not incumbent on the business owner to provide proof of their identity in a way that was harmful or a deterrent to participating in the procurement pipeline itself. And what we're learning is that not only is that there are growing appetite and openness to have a conversation about how to build this type of infrastructure within institutions, but that both institutions as well as diverse suppliers are interested in co-collaborating to build these procurement solutions together, so that not only are there questions, but also solutions being addressed from both sides of the procurement process, but that the questions are being addressed and solutions are being created that satisfy both of the types of curiosities but requirements necessary for a public sector organization, but done so in a way that can be appropriate and accommodating and equitable to diversely owned businesses. And so we're really excited to see where this goes and are hoping to launch a pilot with a number of our anchor institution partners this year. But it takes work. It takes understanding, and it takes leadership and capacity on many levels of not only an organization, but community as a whole. And I think what we've learned up until now is that while there are solutions that are currently working to address inequities built into our institutions, is that we can do better, that we can raise the floor even harder and make it even more accessible and more inclusive for a whole race, a whole range, there we go, the word got out, of folks to be able to see themselves as a part of the procurement pipeline. And I think that is probably, one of the most significant and inherent challenges that we're facing right now, is that people don't see themselves as a part of what the system is engaging with, and overcoming that sort of tension or that negative experience or that overwhelming experience that someone may have had the first time is enough to say, this is not for me. And so I think what we're trying to say with this research is that we're hearing you. We've learned and we understand that what we have in front of us is only a part of the process. And we acknowledge that in order to do better, we have to continue to challenge ourselves and to challenge our thinking and challenge the system to shift in ways that can only be co-created with those of our community.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm excited for that research to come out on self-attestation.
It's coming very soon.
What seems to be a common thread that we're identifying here is an issue of risk tolerance, right? And perceived risk and real risk. And we see that with overinflated requirements, hesitancy to work with diverse suppliers because of embedded racism. So I guess, what advice do you have? Let's start with Dolores, because you have, over 25 years experience in this field.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for purchasers when faced with their own sense of risk to work and expand supply chain diversity?
Well, I think in the number of years that I've experienced, and Hanifa actually spoke about this a bit. Self attestation is really the hope that Indigenous businesses or subcontractors and Indigenous peoples are informing that they meet our Indigenous status of Indian, Métis, and Inuit in accordance to the Constitution Act, Section 35. And in order to do that, we do have to raise the bar, and we do verify these attestations to ensure that um, any contracts being led under the PSIP are really being led to Indigenous businesses that qualify with or for our criteria. So we need to ensure that Indigenous businesses are those that really qualify for our criteria. As the program was developed and established to increase this socioeconomic gap and to allow them for them to be successful in bidding and winning federal contracts under the PSIP. There's different mechanisms that we use and that we verify that. Some are, are joint ventures really a success? Are they not? How do we verify that? We do have a mechanism in place, which is the pre, post, and random audits that we do. And it's really to verify and ensure that it's really truly Indigenous businesses competing against our PSIP mechanisms, which is the mandatory, voluntary, conditional set aside, or participating in what we've called the Indigenous participation components that are really succeeding. When we speak about joint ventures, or when I speak about joint ventures, it means we encourage Indigenous businesses who may not have the capacity or the skills development or the training to bid on a larger contract, but we do encourage them to build these partnerships or joint ventures or subcontracting with other firms. So long as that at the end of the day, when a contract is awarded to our Indigenous business, we can clearly be able to attest that the criteria of PSIP is being met, also the value of the Indigenous content, that it's really truly the Indigenous business that's being able to be successful in that procurement opportunity, and that they are gaining skills development, and that we are creating other opportunities for them to join the various supply chains.
Great. Yeah. I couldn't agree more that, all of these requirements need to also be proportionate to the opportunity. And sometimes they get overinflated, and we need to reduce those barriers so we can increase supplier diversity. We're going to move along to the Q&A now. So we're going to take a look here at the questions. Let's So what is next? What is the next stage in social procurement? How can we help bring it about?
I think Dolores and myself have been alluding to the increased use of models like self-attestation or approaches to certification and validation that are farther down the pipeline. So perhaps when a tender or a contract is awarded, and that they be built into a process that is more equitable. And I think you said it really clearly there, proportional to the value of the contract, right? I recognize that in many cases, at least with the institutions that I'm working with, where we're working with tax dollars and we want them to be spent efficiently and well. And that with that comes often a regulatory framework and a risk tolerance, not only by the institution, but by citizens, by residents, by community members. But at the same time, I think we have to understand that our tolerance has to work both ways, right? Our tolerance for risk to be able to make decisions that are in line with our desire to spend effectively and efficiently, with that of the tolerance for being open and inclusive and equitable. And so I think that the more we understand that these practices are here to stay, that they're here to continue to grow and to evolve, the better we will get at them. And I think that is my hope for the future. Poops. Sorry, my computer's about to die. I'm gonna go get my plug. Of course.
Well, that causes a natural break here. So I wanted to thank you both, Hanifa, if you can hear me, and Dolores, for your sharing and your learnings on this topic. We're going to go into 15-minute table discussions. Before we dive in, we need to acknowledge that conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion can raise a range of emotions, and we recognize that. So please bring respect and kindness to these conversations you have at these tables. We also acknowledge the emotional labor these conversations can require. So please don't feel pressure to engage in a table for this discussion. Some prompts you may choose to discuss in your table are, what are you doing to diversify your supply chain or make it more inclusive and accessible? How did this whole conversation sit with you? Any surprises? Are you scanning your own risk tolerances? And have you explored self-attestation? How comfortable are you with this approach? Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you at the tables.